What if I told you that one of history's greatest empires didn't fall because it was defeated, but because it went completely broke? Picture this. It's August 15th, 1947. You're standing in a massive crowd in Delhi, watching something incredible happen. The British flag, the Union Jack, is being lowered for the very last time. After almost 200 years of control, Britain's grip on India, the crown jewel of their entire empire, is finally over. But here's the crazy part. This wasn't about Britain suddenly growing a conscience. This wasn't some moral awakening. No, Britain was flat out bankrupt. The real story nobody tells you. World War II had absolutely destroyed Britain's economy. Their national debt? Over 200% of GDP. The treasury was empty. And without India's wealth to keep draining, there was simply no way to keep the empire running anymore. Here's what most people don't realize. India's independence wasn't a gift. It was a financial surrender. The British Empire didn't grant freedom. They literally couldn't afford to hold on anymore. And the moment India slipped away, the entire imperial system started crumbling like a house of cards. Where it all began. To really understand how this massive empire collapsed, we need to go back to the very beginning. December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signs a royal charter giving a group of English merchants exclusive trading rights with lands east of Africa and west of the Pacific. They called it the East India Company, and it would become the most powerful and dangerous corporation the world had ever seen. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just trading spices, textiles, and tea. But soon, this company started operating like an entire nation-state. By the 18th century, the East India Company commanded a private army of 260,000 men. That's twice the size of Britain's own military. Think about that for a second. A corporation with its own army, its own currency, its own empire. The turning point. The real turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company was granted something called the Diwani. Basically the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That meant control over 30 million people and one of the richest regions on the entire planet. In just a few years, the East India Company went from being merchants to becoming monarchs, ruling, taxing, and exploiting at will. They monopolized salt, tobacco, and opium. They forced Indian artisans to sell their goods at prices 40% below market value. Weavers who had created some of the world's finest fabrics for generations were reduced to bonded laborers, basically slaves. Then came the horror of the Bengal famine of 1769-1770. Between 7 and 10 million people died. And you know what the East India Company did? Absolutely nothing. They offered no relief. The taxes? They continued as usual. They literally taxed people to death. This wasn't a failure of policy. This was the policy. The de-industrialization of India. Here's a stat that'll blow your mind. In 1750, India made up a quarter of global industrial output, 25%. By 1900, that number had collapsed to just 2%. Why? Because Britain didn't just conquer India, they systematically de-industrialized it. Indian markets were flooded with British goods, sold tariff-free, while Indian producers were crushed under heavy taxes. British factories would buy India's raw cotton for practically nothing, spin it into textiles in their factories, and then sell those same goods back to India at huge profits. Competition? Destroyed. Indian profits? Gone. Between 1850 and 1896, textile imports from Britain exploded from 5 million to 18 million. India's legendary weavers, whose crafts had been celebrated worldwide for centuries, were completely wiped out. And here's the kicker. Between 1600 and 1871, India's GDP per capita fell from over 60% of Britain's to less than 15%. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it made Britain rich beyond imagination. The drug empire. But wait, it gets even darker. The East India Company became the largest drug dealer in the world. They forced Indian farmers to grow opium, which they then exported to China in exchange for silver and tea. When China tried to resist this mass addiction crisis, Britain literally declared war. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842, and they won. Think about that. Britain went to war to defend its right to sell drugs. The opium trade became Britain's second largest source of government revenue, right behind land taxes. India had become the empire's plantation and the empire's victim, paying for their own defeat. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the East India Company's own army rose up in revolt. It was one of the greatest uprisings in colonial history, but Britain crushed it brutally. And then what? They sent India the bill. The entire cost of suppressing the rebellion was charged to Indian taxpayers. They paid for their own defeat. After that, the British Crown took direct control of India, dissolving the company but massively expanding its extraction. The railway myth. You've probably heard people say that Britain's railways were this great gift to India, right? The truth is way darker. Between 1860 and 1890, India's rail network expanded from 1,130 to 25,000 kilometers, all funded by Indian debt. And the contracts, they required that all equipment be purchased from Britain. So India borrowed the money, paid for construction, and Britain pocketed all the profits. That infrastructure was built to move British troops and goods, not to help Indians. The drain of wealth. Economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this the drain of wealth. He calculated that Britain was extracting from India between $30 and $40 million every single year, while reinvesting less than $250,000. He called it vampirism, and honestly, he was absolutely right. When wealth leaves a nation and never comes back, that nation bleeds out. The World Wars. This drain only got worse during the World Wars. By 1918, more than 1 million Indian soldiers had fought for Britain across every major front: Gallipoli, France, Mesopotamia. Over 150,000 were killed or wounded. But even that sacrifice wasn't enough. India shipped millions of tons of wheat, cotton, timber, and supplies, most of it paid for by India itself. The colony even gifted Britain £100 million to fund the war effort. By World War II, the numbers became absolutely catastrophic. The British Indian Army swelled to 3.35 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed its war effort by issuing IOUs called sterling balances, basically massive debts owed to India. By 1945, India was Britain's biggest creditor.
The Bengal famine of 1943. And then came the Bengal famine of 1943, a completely man-made disaster that killed between 800,000 and 3.8 million people. While Indians starved to death, Britain diverted food to Europe. Winston Churchill coldly remarked that Indians must learn to look after themselves as we have done. He even suggested that India should pay Britain for its own defense, using the famine as leverage to erase debt. It was imperial arrogance at its absolute peak. The financial collapse. By the end of World War II, Britain was completely broken. Its debt was twice the size of its economy. Exports had collapsed. The empire was bankrupt. The US stepped in with a $3.75 billion loan, and Canada with another $1.9 billion. Lifelines that Britain wouldn't finish repaying until 2006. But the empire itself? It was finished. Without India's wealth, Britain's machine couldn't run anymore. Independence. Not a gift, but a retreat. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal. By August 15th, the flag came down. It wasn't a gesture of grace or compassion. It was a retreat born of desperation. Check out these numbers. In 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. By 1947, just 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share had risen from 2.9% to 9% during the height of its colonial extraction. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline. When the drain stopped, so did the empire. India's recovery. After independence, India began to rebuild. In 1947, the average life expectancy was just 27 years. By the turn of the century, it had more than doubled. In just a few decades of self-rule, India achieved what 90 years of so-called British development never did. Britain may have won the war, but it lost its empire. The Commonwealth replaced the colonies, and by the 1960s, most of Britain's territories were gone. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet dissolved into history. The warning from history. But here's where it gets really interesting and a little uncomfortable for us Americans. History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. Today, the United States stands where Britain once stood, a global superpower with 750 overseas military bases, trillions in war debt, and a financial system stretched dangerously thin. Britain's power was built on colonial extraction. America's dominance depends on the dollar's supremacy, global trade access, and military presence enforcing it. But here's the thing. When debt piles up and the costs of empires start outweighing the returns, decline begins. Just as Britain's control collapsed when India slipped away, America could face its own reckoning when the dollar loses its global grip. Britain's debt reached 200% of GDP by 1945. America's today? It's not far off. History has already shown us what happens next. Empires don't fall in a single day. They bleed out slowly, through arrogance, through overspending, through the dangerous illusion that power lasts forever. The British Empire's trillion-dollar mistake wasn't just financial, it was moral. It was believing you can drain the world forever without consequence. And when the bill finally came due, the sun that once never set on the British Empire set for good. The question we need to ask ourselves today is, are we paying attention to the warning signs? Or are we destined to repeat the same mistakes? If this video opened your eyes to a side of history they don't teach in school, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Drop a comment below. Do you think America is headed down the same path as the British Empire? I want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.